Thank you, Father Cesari. Well, there are at least two reasons explaining why I have this evening the honor and the pleasure of introducing the lecture by Professor Jean-Luc Marion. I do so first as Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy of the Angelicum, to which the young but promising John Paul II Institute for Culture is attached. And I greet its director, Father Cezary Binchewicz, and several members of the Polish team who are present with us today. Also recently founded, this institute already contributes to the dynamism and intellectual influence of our University of the Angelicum, especially through the excellence of the John Paul II lecture that it sponsors. Thus today, taking advantage of the presence in Rome of Jean-Luc Marion, who came to receive the prestigious Ratzinger Prize for Theology, the Institute is glad to offer to our students and professors, as well as to those who follow us online, this exciting lecture. The second reason why I am happy to introduce this lecture is that I am French, as you may have guessed from my tremendous pronunciation of English, and so a compatriot of Professor Marion. Indeed, Professor Marion is a wonderful fruit of our most prestigious national cultural institution that he, in return, contributes to promote throughout the world. A pupil of the École Normale Supérieure de la Rue d'Ulm, a professor at the Sorbonne, a service director at the Presse Universitaire de France, he even became immortal in 2008, succeeding his friend Cardinal Jean-Marie Lustiger at the famous French Academy. But Professor Marion, as a declared Catholic, is also a major protagonist in French European Catholic thought, through all his work, of course, but also as a collaborator of the French version, French edition of the journal Communio, and is also member of so many multiple church institutions. However, despite a legitimate pride, I am well aware that Professor Marion cannot be reduced to narrow French dimensions, since he also taught in the United States at the University of Chicago, and his work, widely translated, is now internationally recognized and appreciated. I first heard of Jean-Luc Marion when I was in the novitiate in the early 80s. Obviously, not through the ascetical instruction of our master, but through one of my co-novices who had immersed himself with delight in Sur la théologie blanche de Descartes, Descartes' white theology. And this novice shared generously his enthusiasm with every of his friends. But it's above all Dieu sans l'être, God without being, that caught the attention of the theological and Dominican world. And in 1994, Professor Jean-Luc Marion did me the great honor of participating in a conference that I organized as chief editor of the Revue Thomiste on St. Thomas and on theology. On that occasion, Professor Marion gave a masterful study on the very theme of the conference, which is still authoritative today. Some believe at this time that it was a sort of retraction. I don't think so. It was rather a brilliant clarification which, by washing Aquinas of the mortal sin of ontotheology, paves the way for a fresh deepening of Thomistic metaphysics. Be that as it may, the philosopher Marion already at that time offered professional theologians ample matter for thought on a theme as fundamental to them as the nature, purposes, and modalities of human discourse on God. Since then, theological themes have not ceased to hold the attention of Professor Jean-Luc Marion, to the point that, as you know, at the end of the 90s, he engaged in a fascinating debate on the so-called theological turn of phenomenology. This evening, Professor Marion launches to professional theologians another provocation, in the sense of stimulation. Indeed, for several years, at least since the JP2 Lecture in 214, published under the title Giveness and Revelation, Professor Marion has undertaken to enrich the most central theme of revelation with the perspective of a phenomenology of the gift. It is on this exciting theme, the phenomenological openness of revelation, that we are to listen to him with great pleasure this evening.
Prima di tutto voglio ringraziare la facoltà di filosofia dell'Angelicum e il St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, which is connected with questa facoltà, and especially the presentation made by, I shift to English, sorry, for the kind words and very precise presentation made by Professor Bonino as an introduction to this lecture. I want again to say in front of him that we have made a long way together since the early 80s, and that I feel this today meeting as not a conclusion, but I feel this in line with the previous discussion in Toulouse. You have given us a new, renewed memory. So today, I would like to make a rather short presentation of what may be called the phenomenological openness of revelation. I shall make 3 points. First, to raise a question about the philosophical approach to revelation. 2, to suggest a reverse paradigm to have access to a theological concept of revelation. And 3, to give three particular concepts which can work in a phenomenological way within the field of revealed theology. The first point, the question. We all know that the separation of the question of revelation from that of faith was plainly assumed in modern theology, I mean 16th century theology and on, by the distinction of the two trees, one side De Revelatione and the other De Fide. This afforded theology, or to speak like Kant, the faculty of theology, an advantage. The claim to be able to state rational theses, intelligible in themselves, and thus to establish itself, theology, as a science, or even to count itself among the highest faculties, to speak again like Kant, to the very point of claiming, by virtue of the operation of subordination or subalternation of sciences, to reign over the other sciences, Theologia Regina Scientiarum. But this advantage had a price, which had to be paid at the end, in the end. Because the scientificity-led claim by theology remained unspecified and above all invalidated by, and this is the thesis of Thomas Aquinas in the Contra Gentes, by the inaccessibility in this life of the Scientia Dei et Beatorum, which alone could ground theology as a science. So revelation has to submit itself, its supposedly sufficient proposition, to the repeated interpretation of the only reason actually available, the reason of natural light. This counter-interpretation occupied the entire movement, first of the English Enlightenment, Herbert von Cherbury, Locke, Hume, not to speak of Toland, Tyndall, and many others, and at the same, just after that, the French Lumière, above all Rousseau, indeed, and the German Aufklärung with Fichte, Versuch einer Kritik aller Offenbarung, 1793, which anticipated the conclusion of Kant 1 year later in the Religion innerhalb der Grenzen der bloßen Vernunft. This counter-interpretation of revelation triumphed, at least apparently, because the most conservative defender of the revelation themselves came to invoke reason as a natural revelation. Apparently only, however, because at the very moment of this triumph, the victor revealed in many ways the imprecision of the very concept of reason, which was employed to authorize its right to critique revelation. This imprecision of reason was revealed in multiple ways, at least through the notion of critique and concept. Critique can be criticized. Critique lays claim to the limits of reason, either in order to challenge biblical affirmation as irrational, Spinoza, Hume, or in order to reformulate them according to its own norms, sometimes by consciously straining the text as Kant claimed the right to do so. But in thus laying claim to reason, the question arose of the status and legitimacy of these very limits that reason was imposing on religion, without, however, this polemical contrast fixing the concept of one or the other. Of course, from the point of view of Kant, the limits that reason alone impose on the biblical text are justified because they come from the limits that pure reason impose on itself, in its own theoretical exercise. To claim to know nothing, that is, to claim to know nothing by concept, a priori, except that which intuition, in the form of space and time, can give and thus validate. Reason, under understood this way, imposes on the epistemological claim of revelation only the limit that it imposes on its own epistemological function. But this argument can be overturned immediately. For by what right can reason, which only legislates by virtue of its essential finitude, and which, with respect to this finitude, strictly confines itself to knowing only objects, claim to impose its limits, this norm of its finitude, on that which, by principle, biblical text, proposes itself as a transgression of finitude through the intervention of infinite. We do not have to wait for Hegel to oppose the question of infinite and on the absolute to the concept of critique. It is enough to listen, for instance, to Schleiermacher. I quote, "Everything that exists is necessary for religion, and everything that can be is for it a true, indispensable image of infinite." And moreover, when philosophy imposed in the name of its reason a strict moral interpretation of revelation, as Kant did and Fichte, does it still respect its own limit? Does not it surpass them by qualifying in this way finite morality with the prestigious title of moral God, crowning finitude to the acknowledgement, I quote Fichte, the acknowledgement of God as moral lawgiver? In a word, if reason, as exercised in the end by the system of metaphysics, remains finite and reason alone, can it still impose, without any other justification, its limit on that which, by definition, formally is indifferent to limits? It is what appears for reason, which is to say, for us, mortal, still impossible for the gods or for those taking their place, for whom everyone agrees that if there are any gods, nothing is impossible to them. This reason, by extending the jurisdiction of its finitude to that which is at the very least, to that which at the very least claims to be free of it, namely the infinite, attests the undecisiveness of its own concept of critique. Thus, reason should be questioned. And it is here that we could make the same argument against the concept of concept, to speak like Hegel. The concept, in the tradition achieved by Hegel, is supposed to lift to rational evidence any sensitive experience. Linked to revelation or to any philosophy of religion, the concept should allow to build up what Schelling called the philosophy of revelation. But it does so resting on an ambiguity which appears more clearly in German, where, according to Hegel, two concepts can be used as almost equivalent. First, the evident knowledge by concept, when lifted at the level of achieved rationality, is what Hegel called the revealed knowledge, of German geoffenbarte Erkenntnis. It is a knowledge which is made completely clear, unveiled. And this geoffenbarte Erkenntnis is identified repeatedly, it is the core of his argument, by Hegel with the Offenbarung. The Offenbarung, biblical Offenbarung, should be assumed under the condition to be reduced to the geoffenbarte Erkenntnis, that is, the concept. Is it possible to save, it was the intention of Hegel and Schelling, to save the Offenbarung, that is, strictly speaking, the apocalypse in biblical meaning, by assimilating it to the clear and distinct idea of the geoffenbarte Erkenntnis. And this is on this second point that we can criticize very strictly, and I think strongly, the achievement of the philosophy of religion according to German idealism and to modern metaphysics. To sum it up, my question is, can we and must we consider what is uncovered by revelation be registered within the field of what is unfolded by reason? Are unconcealed and uncovered the same thing? What reason unconceals, that is the truth, aletheia, veritas, does it proceed according to the same way and the same operation as what revelation uncovers? My point is this. Is the process of unconcealing in philosophy producing the aletheia? The same operation than what revelation by apocalypse uncovers. Uncovering is uncovering the same thing as unconcealing. I think that we cannot take for assumed that the aletheia, philosophy, uncovering, is equal, it can grasp, the apocalypse, uncovering of revelation, unconcealing aletheia, uncovering apocalypse. My suggestion is that revelation is not another way to reach the same evidence and unconcealment as philosophy does in the aletheia. It is another way to question, and more comprehensive one. And perhaps theology starts when we try to face the apocalypse which uncovers and not the aletheia which unconceals. Not that the apocalypse would trigger less aletheia, but as I shall try to explain, much more. How could we reach a more precise approach of this opposition? I suggest to take the example, a famous example of the aletheia, of the veritas, which can be found in Descartes. Descartes, in the Meditationes de Prima Philosophia, in the fourth of them, give a very famous definition of a true statement. A true statement is when occurs when, I quote, a great light in the intellect was followed by a great inclination in the will. Ex magna luce in intellectu, magna consecuta est propensio in voluntate. That is, we have first a light which unconceals, and the result is that in good faith, a fair philosopher decides that this should be assumed as truth. And this assumption is made by the will. So the will follows what is unconcealed by the great light in the understanding. This can be taken for granted. A philosopher, at least a modern philosopher, starts always with the idea vera, as Spinoza used to say. We have ideae verae, and we have just to first identify those and start with that by combining them and so on. And after all, the absolute science, according to Hegel, is just the fulfillment of this program. When we read seriously ancient theologians, for instance, 12th century theologians I'm very interested in, for instance, in William of St. Thierry, we read, and this is Speculum Filii, section 25, we read this: non tam ratio voluntatem, quam voluntas traere videtur rationem ad fidem. I translate, for it is not so much the reason that draws the will toward the evidence as the will that draws the reason toward faith. Notice that the two words, the two concepts are there: will and reason for intellectus. The same as in Descartes, but in reverse order. There, it is the will, voluntas, who comes first. Why it is perhaps a bit bold to connect Descartes to William of St. Thierry, but we can make this connection for a good reason. It is that Pascal, in the art of persuasion, l'art de persuader, Pascal, who was a very good reader of Descartes, one of the best, criticized him and deeply understood, and was very well known through his friends of Port-Royal who were giving quotations and things like that, was quite aware of Saint Bernard and William of St. Thierry and so on, and the fathers, make the same opposition that I have sketched between Guillaume de St. Thierry and Descartes. I read the text. So it is in the De l'art de persuader. Hence, said Pascal, instead of speaking about human matters, that they have to be found before they can be loved, speaking about human matters, we can say they have to be known before they can be loved, which, instead of this, the saint, speaking of divine matters, say that we have to love them in order to know them, and that you enter into truth only by charity, which you have made into one of their most powerful pronouncements. The French is very clear as well. De là vient qu'au lieu qu'en parlant des choses humaines, on dit qu'il faut les connaître avant que de les aimer, ce qui est passé en proverbe. So this is the position of Descartes. Concerning human things, we have to know them before loving them. That is, willing them, assuming them. On the contrary, the saint says, Guillaume de Saint-Thierry, about divine things, that you have first to love them in order to know them. And to support this reversal of the order, he quotes, implicitly but clearly, St. Augustine. St. Augustine, who, in a famous text in the Contra Faustum, chapter 32, section 18, I say famous because he's quoted by Heidegger in Sein und Zeit, in a very tricky way, but it is not the point. St. Augustine says, probamus etiam, ipsum spiritum sanctum, inducere in omnem veritatem, quia non intratur in veritatem nisi per caritatem. You cannot get into truth but through charity. Caritas autem Dei diffusa est, ut ait apostolus in cordibus nostris per spiritum sanctum, qui datus est nobis, Roman 5:5. And indeed, when Heidegger quotes, as quoted, non intratur in veritatem nisi per caritatem, he dropped the quotation by Paul. This is not the point. The point is that I suggest that here the opposition of the two orders between intellectus, two concepts between intellectus and will or love, this double connection, the reversal of the connection, was seen with great lucidity by Pascal, because he has seen the turning point between two traditions. And what I conclude from this is that there is another paradigm of truth where the love of truth, the love of wisdom, philosophia, is achieved in a reversed order, where, and this is literally the meaning of philosophia, when philein, or love, come first. Because the paradox of the concept of philosophy as used in our time is that indeed there is no question of love of truth in any faculty of philosophy, except perhaps this faculty, indeed. I mean that we have completely forgotten the meaning of philein in philosophy. And the reverse order suggested by here William Saint-Thierry and Pascal, the reverse order fit exactly with the old meaning of philosophy. So what we have now to understand is how this new paradigm, where love or will come first, can be a bit explained. So there is a long, many ways to do that, and I shall not develop all of them. It will lead us too far. The first formulation which should be studied is a formulation of St. Augustine in the commentary of the Gospel according to John, chapter 26, section 5, where he has this strange formula. Ista attractio, ipsa est revelatio. It is a strange formula for many reasons. The first is one of the very few use of revelatio by Augustine. So revelatio is an attractio. What does that mean? In fact, this formula comes as a way to sum up his own interpretation of John 6, chapter 6, verse 44. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Eccuse eoton, traxerit in eum. So the Gospel says, John says, that no one can come to me, revelatio, if he is not attracted by the Father. What does that mean, attracted? Augustine raised immediately the objection. How can we love by attraction? Because we cannot love if we don't love by free will. And without free will, an attraction is not love. There is no revelation without free will. So why should we be attracted by anyone, including the Father? But, answer to that. When you love, de facto, you are always attracted. You are attracted, traitur animus et amore, by your mind and your love. And Augustine make a sketch of a phenomenology of love, that is, you cannot be loved if you are not attracted by your love. That is to say, your will at that moment is the attraction itself. And he says, this is brilliant, he says, he takes an example and says, give me someone who is in love and he will understand what I mean. Da amantem et sentit quod dico. So when I love because I am attracted. And he's bold enough to quote, to explain the gospel, a verse by Virgil in the Aeneid, Trait sua quemque voluptas. Every man is drawn by his own pleasure. After that, he gives two quotations from the Psalm. We say you will be drawn by the pleasure of paradise and of the house of God. To conclude, amando traitur. He is attracted by the very fact that he is loving. So, when the Father attracts someone to Jesus, to Christ, it is de facto the core of the will which is working. Because the core of willing is loving. And there is no other way to love. It's why there is such a problem of the weakness of the will. The weakness of the will is when you imagine that will is ruled by reasons. There are some American philosophers who are naive to the point to imagine that we love because we have good reasons. We will because we have reasons. And making this brilliant argument, they are a bit surprised by the fact that with the best reason, we can be unable to will what we should will. In fact, we will what we love, not what we can argue for. And the argument comes after the decision, which is made by desire and by attraction. So the mystery of revelation is, in fact, the mystery of our will. The mystery of our will is the question of love, and love, at the end of all arguments, is decided between God and me. And so, strictly speaking, we will because God make us love God. This is the core of the argument. And I would add another sketch of another argument. Again, to be found in William of Saint-Thierry. William of Saint-Thierry is really brilliant. And to the point that is in Speculum Filii, for instance, section 64, he argues that in the things which are related to God, quae sunt ad Deum, sensus mentis est amor. The mind, the sense, not the five senses in the sensible experience, sensitive experience, but the sense of the mind is love. That is, to understand things related to God, we have to love. It is the operation of the mind. The operation of the mind concerning God is only love. And to the point that he comes to the conclusion, which is in Speculum Filii, section 2. Voluntas enim haec aliquantus iam amor Christi est. The will is in a certain way already the love of Christ. There is no access to the thing of God but through the sense of love, and the voluntas, the will, is in reverse order, to some extent already yet a love of Christ. So, or another formulation in the De Natura Dignitate Amoris, section 25. Ratio docet amorem, et amor illuminat rationem. Reason teaches love, and love illuminates reason. That is, in the case of God, reason is identified, so to speak, with love. And this is crucial. That is, we have indeed a theoretical relation to the truth of God. But this theoretical approach is submitted to another approach. Which one? The approach where the disclosing of the mystery of God, the knowledge of God, is made possible by the fact that by willing, by loving, I am ready to be uncovered in front of God. I suggested that there is a more comprehensive understanding of truth in the case of apocalypsis, uncovering, than in the case of mere aletheia, unconcealing. We start to understand why. In the theoretical approach, where we go from intellectus to the statement by will, in that case, the disclosure is on something which remains in front of me and which is not myself. In the case of uncovering, apocalypsis, where I have first to love, to understand, credo ut intelligas, to some extent, not only there is the disclosure of the truth of God, But to have access to that truth of God, you have to agree that this truth is not only without any common measure with your own mind, but that it will display a terrible light on yourself. That is, what is uncovered is not only what you see, but also yourself. And Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine has explained this in book 11 of the Confessiones in a striking way, when he explains that there is two truths, the veritas lucens and the veritas redargens. In the veritas lucens, the more we see the light, the more we know, and the more we are pleased. That is, in sciences, the more you understand this field in fundamental physics, or this theory in mathematics, or this rule in logic, the more you agree and the more you are pleased. You become a scholar. But when you reach divine things, and I would say not only divine things, in fact, a large part of these allegedly only human things, when you face light, not only what you see is under that light, but yourself. This is the veritas redargens. The veritas redargens is that, the example of a veritas redargens is that when you have done something wrong, as a citizen, you are pleased that the justice asks you questions. La legge is eguale per tutti. Mais as a person, you are displeased, at least, that some light may be shed on your behavior, and you feel guilty and feel shame and things like that. And in human relationships, it is often the case. Why do we lie? We lie because we hate some kind of light. When this light goes back to us, when we are no more the impartial scholar, but we are a part of the scene, a part of the plot. And when light is shed on us as well, and not only on what we know. This is the apocalypse. It's why in the epistemology of theology, again, it is highly possible that it may be the case even in some part of philosophy or science. At least in theology, any new step in the discovery of truth shed more light on the discoverer. And we are under the spot of light. And it's why there is the double meaning of apocalypse. Apocalypse means that everything is uncovered and everything is submitted to a judgment. And this judgment is not a judgment coming from outside. It is a judgment we can pass very well, very easily on ourselves. When our sin is visible, we are the first aware of it. We have no need of a terrible judge outside. This is an imagination. And according to the Gospel of John, Christ has no need to judge us. We do that very well. And it is the Inferno of Dante. So, we understand quite well that when it is about revelation in the theological meaning, the usual philosophical concept of truth remains too narrow. It cannot grasp the entire dimension of the unconcealment, the of what is uncovering itself, the mystery, to speak like Paul. And as you know well, because you know your theology well, the mystery in Paul has something very strange, is that it is known. The mystery is known. It is not crypted according to this sentence which can be found in the three synoptics. Nothing concealed which will not be discovered. So the mysterium is discovered, and it is why it is rejected. It is not rejected because it is concealed. Would the mysterium remain concealed, it would not be rejected indeed. It is because it is rejected that we feel in accusation by the lux redargens, by the new meaning of the apocalypse, and we can reject the truth. This is an experience, I think, crucial in theology. Truth is not rejected because it is not known. Truth is rejected because it is known. So we can now go to my third point. In that context, I shall be shorter. We understand that the manifestation of revelation of apocalypse implies some new conditions. And the first is precisely about the conditions. In regular critical philosophy, German idealism, Kant, and theory of science, Academie theory, there is a rule: we can understand only the phenomena which can become objects, that is, which can satisfy the a priori condition of possibility of knowledge, the rule of reason. And it is clear that in a phenomenon of revelation, the revelation has to contradict the condition of possibility of phenomenality in a way or another. And the so-called obscurity of the manifestation of God in Jesus Christ. Si vous voulez dire, the kenosis is the result of the contradiction between the wide apocalypse of the mystery and the limitations of the experience possible to finite mind in a particular historical situation. This contradiction is a part of revelation. Would revelation not contradict the condition of possibility of the common experience in a way or another? I don't mean that it contradicts the possibility of intelligibility, but the rules of the possibility of the objects, there would be no revelation at all. We have to keep in mind this a bit violent and brutal paradox by Barthes, but Barthes has to be used that way. He says that, Isaiah, I am a voice and I call to make right the way of the Lord and to feel the valley and to redress and so on. He says this will never be the case. The world and the man will never be well prepared to receive the revelation. The revelation will always appear as a contradiction, sign of contradiction. If not, it would not be a revelation of God. So this contradiction of by revelation, that is the substitution of the apocalypse to the paradigm of the aletheia, in my language, so to speak, can be explained with three kind of definition. The first is that revelation is always a saturated phenomenon. By saturated phenomenon, we understand a phenomenon where, against the classical definition by Kant and Husserl, the concept or the intention or the signification will never match the quantity of intuition. And in Kant and Husserl, most of the phenomenon are usual phenomenon, are in fact deprived of enough intuition. There is always a lack of intuition in the object. The object is known more by concept than by intuition. And this is the concept without an intuition, because I don't know how this microphone works. And all technical objects, it is the same situation. We don't know of our car more than the concept, how to use it, how to fire the engine, how to deal with the gear, how to brake, and how to drive. But we don't know, we have no intuition of the details of the phenomenon. So most of the time we are used to poor phenomenon we are poor in intuition, and it is the right way to use them. Indeed, education leads us to privilege the most easy to use objects. That is, those we can rule, master, use just by knowing what is written in the description of the product. So there is one page of things to understand, and then it goes. So we are in the daily life, the less we have intuition, the more we feel comfortable. In the other phenomena, we experience an excess of intuition, so we don't know what is coming on. We don't know what it is. We don't know what is going on, and we are puzzled by the fact that there is more intuition on stage than our concept can embrace. And indeed, everything connected to Christian revelation is a phenomenon of that kind. And so there is something a bit naive, epistemologically speaking, in common exegesis, when the great biblical scholar asks himself whether this description is authentic or not, whether it is an exaggeration by poetic skill or it has to be taken seriously. The fact is that in se, and by definition, there is exaggeration in a revelation. So there can be a lot of explanation of that exaggeration, indeed. But don't be surprised that the biblical texts are full of exaggeration, because they describe saturated phenomena. The second point, let us take an example of that. It is the story of the Transfigurations. In the Transfigurations, the disciples, without permitted to glimpse by anticipation the glory of the resurrection, not only did not doubt the intuition. The countenance of Christ became altered, say Luke, like sun, say Matthew. His arguments were like light, Matthew, of a whiteness so intense as no fuller on earth could bleed them, Mark. So not only intuition is not lacking, but the difficulty is seeing, on the contrary, the excess of intuition. And what is lacking, there is no doubt about the intuitive reality of the scene. The doubt is about the fact that they have no concept to understand that. It's why Peter tries to say something, and with remembrance of the Old Testament, he assumes that the two guys on the side of Jesus are Moses or Elijah, and he's speaking, and both Luke and Mark notice that he did not know what to say. He had no concept. And this is the right signification. And what was the right concept for the Transfiguration? It is the voice coming from the sky, who says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." The same voice which gave the right concept at the moment of the baptism, and will be repeated on John 12, I think, on the in front of the temple before the death of Christ. "This is my Son," and Jesus said, "This voice is for you." Last attempt to give them the right concept. So the right concept in front of the saturated phenomenon of transfiguration of Christ and so on comes from above, from elsewhere, not from us. We have to learn it. This is saturated phenomenon. And in front of a saturated phenomenon, there is a second fundamental situation, which is the situation of the witness. We have to be very careful about the role of the witness. The witness has a negative and a positive role. The positive role of the witness is that he is absolutely convinced that he has experienced something. The witness in John 9, the born blind, which is cured and sees for the first time, he has no doubt about that. And he is ready to say, to give testimony, and repeatedly to say, I was blind, I see. To the point that the ministry in the temple, the scribes, are outrageous because of the obstinacy. But at the same moment, when asked, who has made you no more blind but seeing, he say, ukoida, I don't know. So it is at the beginning because by fear of punishment, exclusion of the synagogue, and so on. But it is true. The witness has the intuition,
but he has not the concept. And it is exactly back to legal situation. A witness, when asked by the policia about the case, can say something without knowing the real meaning of the incident, because he is not in the inquiry, he does not know the files, and the inspector knows much more of the concept of the case than the witness. So the witness may ignore the meaning of the fact he is telling. He gives to the records less than the records perhaps already knows. So this is the situation of the witness. It's why the witness has himself to try to get access to the right concept. It's why when there is a miracle, the beneficiary of the miracle is cured, but it is just the beginning of the story, because the real thing is not to admit the obvious fact of the intuitive healing. It is to understand the meaning of this healing. That is that Jesus is the Son of God. And in case of John 9, it is clear that it takes a rather long time for the blind man to realize that he is in front of the Messiah. Same thing for in John 4 with the woman of Samaria. And in all the case of miracle, the miracle implies that, and to admit that Jesus is the Son of God, you have to tell the truth about you. The wife of Samaria has to admit that his matrimonial life is not quite regular, and she admits that. And you are cured not only in your body, but in your sins. So you have to admit your sins. And so the witness is exactly our situation. In fact, when we are reluctant, both baptized Christians and non-believers, in fact, the difficulty is not the lack of intuition, because there is a great quantity of intuition in history, in psychology, in philosophy, in culture, to support the hypothesis of Christianity. But we are reluctant because of the concept, because of the apocalypse, because of the fact that we are at stake as person and not only playing the role of the scholar who knows things. And the last concept which should be introduced here is again the concept of paradox. There is a lot to be said about the paradox. We all know that there is a tradition in modern philosophy to consider the paradox as a logical failure. Russell, in On Denoting, or Quine, in a book rather interesting, is The Way of Paradox, and other essays published in 1966, are the best example of this attempt to reduce the paradox to a confusion on the level of language. But there are paradoxes which not only cannot be reduced, but should not. The best theory of paradox was given by Kierkegaard, who used to say, among other things, that philosophy is fed by paradox. Without paradox, there is no good philosophy. And it's why boring philosophy, that is philosophy without paradox, common sense philosophy, is never very good. And you know this rule. If a philosophical book is boring, drop it. Life is short. And what is a paradox? A paradox is a contradiction between the rule of the finite word, of finite reasons, the condition, the a priori condition of experience, and a fact which cannot be explained according to those concepts. And in that case, there is a paradox. But the paradox can be the most radical truth. Kierkegaard again says, don't speak badly of paradox. A philosophy without paradox would be like Don Giovanni without desire. I think it's correct. So the paradox is the moment when what we take for granted as a logical statement falls short. Example. If one wants to keep his life, he will lose it, and if he loses his life, he will keep it. But in fact, it is the most profound logic at a philosophical level yet of the meaning of life. I don't possess my life, and I will lose my life anyway by dying. So what can I do to allow something of my life not to disappear? To give. Everything which is not given at the end will be lost. Only what was given the right moment to the right person will survive. And after all, if we write books, it is just to give them and to survive, or to make what looked for you as true to survive. So this is a paradox, but it is the exact truth of life. I don't possess my life. I shall be led to give it up because I receive it without reasons, and I shall give it up without reason. And the only way is to give it willingly. So, saturated phenomenon, witness, and paradox means that the phenomena in the apocalypse are no more objects, they are saturated phenomena. In the apocalypse, I am no more the ego transcendental subject, the origin of experience, and the origin of the constitution of the objects. And the paradox, my logic is only a finite logic, which is always overruled when I take the point of view coming from elsewhere. And those three concepts, I think, can make more intelligible the reversal of the aletheia into the apocalypse. That is the clear understanding of why revelation can happen and has happened. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Marion, thank you very much for exquisite lecture, and now we still have a little time for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Marion, for your lecture. It was very, very clear, I think. I have two questions. The first one is, what do you think about the statement? With that question comes to the so-called private revelations. What can we, the private revelation? Thank you.
Question was very burning issue some years ago in Paris. I remember well. It is not a serious question. I mean, there is a closure of revelation indeed, because we are between the two manifestations of Christ. So the first is achieved, and the reports of the first is achieved. The apostolic time is over, and there is no other possible revelation. We have to stick to the paradox of explained by John of the Cross in the je crois, c'est 2:20. God has nothing wrong to say. He has given every word in the word. The word, the logos, was given. All the logoi are given. And nevertheless, there is a progression in revelation. Those two are not in opposition, because the progression, the sign of time and things like that, the sign of times, are, it is because the saturated phenomenon is achieved, and because it is saturation of any concept by the amount of intuition, that we are now in charge to find again and again new concepts to match the quantity, the infinite quantity of intuition. That is, the interpretation of revelation, of the fact of revelation, follows directly from the inadequation of our concepts with the intuition. Everything is given, but everything is not understood. So there is, in general, I think, a rule in phenomenology, at least for me, there is a rule. Everything which appears is given, but not everything which is given does appear. Because in many cases, by ignorance, bedazzlement, weakness, and so on, we cannot transform the intuition into a visible phenomenon. And progress in theology follows that rule. That is, much more is implied
in the biblical text than we have yet understood. And it's why there is a progression of dogma. The progression of dogma, Barth says that dogma are eschatological. That means that the dogma are a step, new dogmas, reinterpretation of the former dogma, are a way to improve the concepts we can use to understand what was given in the intuition. So, if by progression of revelation you mean a new gospel, a third time of the church, and so on, history gives enough evidence that this leads to catastrophes, heresy, and more than that, catastrophes. So there is no new church to wait for. But there is a lot of work to build up the strong and precise concept, allowing us to have a better understanding of what is given.
Thank you very much, Professor. I just wanted to ask, what is your response to theologians who would insist on a real scientific method in theology? So I'm thinking, for example, classically of Bernard Lonergan. Is he someone that would be sort of at another end of theological methods to what you're saying? Or can we say that there's something of an epistemological inferiority complex amongst some theologians that have lost confidence in a proper theological epistemology?
You raise a very serious question. I think that definitively theology should be a science. But today, what the difficulty is to give a definition of science. It is true in, I would say, ordinary science as well. It is not only theology, but also fundamental physics who has to face paradoxes. So we cannot have a narrow understanding of the standards of scientificity. What we know for sure now, that scientificity should be modified according to the fields of inquiry. This was true for physics, mathematics, which have to take to assume paradoxes. It is true for the so-called human sciences, social sciences, which always are in a way to redefine the criteria of truth, of demonstration, time to time to admit that there can be sciences without complete certitude and things like that. And so in theology, the criteria of truth, of scientificity, should be re-examined. For instance, is theology an empirical science? Is there empirical verification in theology? I would say yes. But those experiences which can verify a proposition or disqualify a proposition, in the case of theology, are very special experiences. But in mathematics, you have to be trained in mathematics to make mathematical experiences. In physics, you have to have great labs and a lot of machines to get your crucial experiences, if any. In art, there are experiences, but no one is qualified to be a good judge. So if you are not trained in music and with hearing sensibility, you have no musical experience. So in theology, your experience is broad to the exact measure where you are trained in the mystery. That is, your degree of sanctity is your degree of scientificity. This is a paradox, but in fact, it is a fact. The result is that to be bold enough to try to work in theology, you have to improve your experimental skills. That is to be not too deeply a sinner, to be a better Christian, which is very difficult. And the other thing, not to pay too much respect to the epistemology of other sciences. It is quite fascinating for a philosopher to see how naive many non-believers are, although they are great scholars in other fields, when they speak about theology. They have no idea what it is. And so they don't recognize their own criteria of certitude, so they decided that it's rubbish. And the other surprise is that many, even great and well-known theologians, in fact, they assume some philosophical presupposition without any reservation. I think I'm not, I can say that. In the past century, many, I would say, German theologians have assumed, in a way or another, an Hegelian interpretation of revelation to an extent which was not only uncritical, but led them into no ends. And so a good theologian has first to be a good critical philosopher. And it is crucial. We have seen, Father Bonino has seen that as well, in France during the 60s, 70s, 80s, a rush of many theologians or self-proclaimed theologians to take over all the presupposition of the so-called human sciences without any reservation. It has led to disaster, forgotten disaster. It had not lasted very long. Okay, but they could have spared that. So, for instance, I'm using phenomenology, but under the condition to correct the phenomenology. For instance, I'm not Heideggerian about the question of being. I'm against Husserl about the identification of a known phenomenon and an object. The concept of saturated phenomenon is opposing face-to-face, frontally, Husserl. It is against section 39 of the sixth logical investigation. And so you have to correct the philosophy you use in theology. And if there is no correction, there is no theology. Because again, a real theology should be based on revelation. And if there is any revelation, it should contradict the normal, so-called normal condition of rationality.
Thank you very much, dear Professor, for your very interesting lecture. I have two questions. The first one is about culture. In your opinion, which role plays the culture refer to understanding the culture, yes. Plays the culture refer to understanding the human reason, ratio, as a ratio, as a place or as a receiver of divine revelation. This is the first question. And the second one, if we assume that ratio, so our reason, is a receiver of revelation, should be, or have we to speak about different histories of revelations in plural? And if it is so, how we can explain in the best way the particularity of Jewish Christian revelation which finished in the person of Jesus Christ? So in the sense of Dominus Jesus.
Well, I'm not sure that I understood everything you meant. But thank you for asking a question about the calcio. Although it is a bit difficult to speak calcio being a French in Italy, because I'm very sad that you are not yet qualified. But I was glad that you won the European, because it is far better to have you champion of Europe than the Brit. Well, there is another reason why to speak of calcio is important, because Sartre, in the critique of dialectical reason, has a long chapter on calcio team. He explained that a team is like a revolutionary group in demonstration. They are very excited and they feel united all together against the other. In that case, there are only one body. And he makes it so le ballon, comment dit-on, the ball. The ball is everywhere and so on. And at the end of the chapter, there is a footnote where Sartre adds. The point is that in real competition, there are two teams on the field, period. So it's a way you have not to use calcio in philosophy that way. So let us do better than Sartre did, which is not always very, very difficult. There is something very, 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 very important in calcio. It is the goalkeeper, because it is the concept of to receive. One of the objections quite often made against my doctrine of the gift, the givenness, and so on, is it that the witness or the adonné, the adonato, the gifted, plays only a passive role. So you deprive the ego of any active role, assuming that this leads to transcendentalism and so on and so on. So what remains is a Buddhist ego, completely passive. This is a very superficial understanding of receiving a given or a gift. Because when you receive, you are active. If you are a goalkeeper and you receive the ball and you stop the ball, you have to be very tough to do that. And Simone Weil used to say that against evil, there is only one thing to do, is to receive it and to block it. That is to be passive in such a way that you stop the transmission of evil. You can say that Christ has done exactly that on the cross. He stopped evil, who could not go through. Solzhenitsyn used to say about lying, which was a regular way of speaking in the Soviet Union. At least people can lie, but lie will not go through me. I will stop lying. And I think that when you have the given coming on you, to receive the given and to send the given back, as a good player, field player in calcio does. You know why some are quicker than others, and they can go through the line of the defense. It is because when they get the ball, they receive the ball, they don't make first a move to control the ball, and then another move to send the ball again to another partner. They do that only in one move. Zidane was super to do that. That is the pass control, the same. And so a good player, a good receiver, is a guy who can receive and send back in the same move. And it's why the distinction between passivity and activity is completely inadequate in sport and in phenomenology as well. It's only you are a bad player that you are first passive, then active. A good player has to be both. In tennis, this is very clear as well. John McEnroe was a very good guy to resend the ball. And the better the serve was, the stronger the serve was, tougher, the better the receiver was. So this distinction, activity, passivity, for instance, in fact, it is one of the categories by Aristotle. It works for beings in the world. It does not work for being out of the world, that is human beings. And it is not by chance that the first paragraph of the treatise, the Passion de l'âme, Passion of Soul, by Descartes, is criticizing the difference between activity, action, and passion in Aristotle. I am Cartesian on that.
Professor Marion, thank you very much again. Thank you very much for your presence here. And in the end, I would like to invite you to the next lecture from JP2 Lectures series by Professor George Weigel, which will take place on December 9th at 2:30. Sorry. Thank you very much.